So yeah, without further ado, Ian, do you want to kick us off with a few words about yourself, and then call up your presentation?
Will do indeed. Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. As you said, I've mainly worked on 18th century retailing in sort of northern Midland England and published a few things around that. Last few years, I've been working on a project around late 19th century retailing, which sort of change of century, but still similar sort of territory. Well, really trying to sort of focus on the act of shopping rather than sort of just consumption, because I think people tend to sometimes miss out on that particular thing. And last sort of bit of work I did was around markets and market halls, which ended up in the Economic History Review a couple of years back, and have been moving on and looking at the co-op. And so this paper actually is part of that work on the co-op. I will attempt to share my screen because I have got some slides which may or may not help. I don't know if it's going to work or not. Yeah.
There they are. You're good to go.
Yeah. So yeah, the co-op. Yeah, that's okay. Just things that sort of people are, I'm sure, familiar with anyway, but just as a sort of starting point. In the period I'm looking at, we're talking about a pretty big player in the co-op. By 1900, sort of 7% of all retail sales, about 15% of all grocery sales. By the First World War, 1,000 or so societies, 3 million members. Big player, and some very big societies with 50, 60,000 members. And again, we're probably familiar with the sort of principles which it tried to found itself on. The sale of pure goods, no adulteration, know where your sources are, and to a lesser extent, because I've done a bit of work around this, trying to source them from places that followed decent employment practices such as they were. Not giving credit, which didn't mean that you couldn't actually get your goods Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then pay on Friday. But it meant, in theory, at least, that you weren't supposed to run at large credit amounts, though I've certainly come across a number of societies that have quite sophisticated credit systems for their customers. So that's honoured, I think, more in the breach than the reality. The obvious thing is the payment of the dividend. There's effectively a cashback on purchases that you pick up possibly every 6 months, maybe more frequently, and can be as much as 10%. So it's a fair bit of money if you can afford to pay the slightly higher prices and then wait for the money to come in so you can purchase something else, and I'll come back to that. And education, money allocated out of profits to provide education, social facilities, welfare facilities, mainly for members. That's a sort of background to it all. But what does it actually look like? I've put in a picture of Ripley, which is northeast Derbyshire, mining area. This is sort of round about the turn of the century, is their central stores, which looks to me like a department store. It looks to me like the sort of largish store that you would see in many of many towns of that nature. And if we actually then go inside a different one, to Sheffield, a little bit later, you're looking at something, to my mind at any rate, that looks pretty middle class, pretty smart, probably some shop walkers around. If you've just walked in out of your factory in your slightly filthy overalls, you're not going to walk in there. So there seems to me, initially at any rate, a sort of image problem, if there is nothing else, that you're not particularly likely to go venturing into some of these very large central stores that sell everything from probably groceries, other provisions, clothing, millinery, furniture, etc., etc., unless you are at least affluent working class. So there is an issue that the co-ops did themselves actually recognise. What do you do about reaching out to slightly poorer communities? They have clearly got a decent branch network, just some small examples from the Derby area, and suggestions that really come forward, and the co-op was aware of this. You come across quite a lot of instances where co-op members have heard a paper about how can we reach out to the poorer areas in our town. And the ideas that come up are, where do you source your goods from, co-op producers? Keep the dividend modest. Don't actually, basically try and focus on prices, and maybe actually have particularly low price shops in poorer areas. And all that sounds incredibly obvious, but might be actually easier to talk about than actually to achieve. And in this context, let me say just at this point something about the Women's Cooperative Guild. Because very often what was going on in the cooperative movement to try and actually extend the reach beyond, I say, the sort of more affluent areas or the more affluent working class areas, was done by many of the women who look like a wonderful set of Victorian women, if you can actually see the slide. And it's to spread the knowledge of cooperation, of its principles and its practice. Very focused on women's rights, in a sense. I mean, quite a few of them get involved in the suffrage movement, they get involved in issues around divorce law reform, and they get involved in practical and other ways of supporting the disadvantaged. So quite a bit of the initiative about what you do about poor areas comes from the Women's Cooperative Guild. And it strikes me that there are three main ways that they can use. One is to do with information, just simply finding out more about what is going on in the various towns where there is a co-op. And the Women's Guild is often fairly prominent in this. So an inquiry in Sheffield, which picks up fairly obvious things. The general shops tend to be pricey but are convenient. That there are a lot of people were using trading clubs, so they would pay a certain amount of money in and then be actually able to get their articles before they were fully paid for, but they became tied to particular shops. And a great deal of use of credit. And the point the people inquiring in the early 1900s made was, well, you know, you would save a couple of pence in the shilling if you could actually pay cash rather than credit. And one of the other things that I picked up, again looking at some of the Women's Guild stuff, was that in Ipswich they actually compared prices in the co-ops and in various general stores, and they compared quality and the presentation. So it's just finding out a bit more about what's going on. That's the first part of it. The second, which I think is probably the most significant bit, is actually trying to do something about providing shops in poorer areas. The problem isn't so much that you can't spread out into the suburbs of certain towns, or even you can't spread out into some of the more affluent areas. This again, the picture is Stonebroom, which is a mining village in northeast Derbyshire. Came from absolutely nothing in the sort of 1860s to a medium-sized village by the 1880s. And again, the store there looks respectable. It's got all the sort of things you'd expect if you saw a picture of an independent grocer of exactly the same period. So it's not the Stonebroom which is the problem. It's not the sort of areas where you have got people with a steady wage and a fairly steady job. It's the much more depressed areas of some of the larger towns. And they do various experiments. They try in Workington to have a go at ready money only, cheap goods, low dividend. But are told in the end, actually, the customers who went there prefer the high dividend to saving a couple of pence on the actual shopping. But if you could save, then it's useful. An experiment in York is a bit better. A grand opening of a shop with they're very fond of tea, and I'm actually having an afternoon tea with people, and samples of their goods given away. And they supplied takeaway food. The best documented one that I've come across, which is quite familiar to many people, I think, who've worked on the co-op, was in Sunderland, where they managed to set up a shop, Coronation Street, definitely a deprived area, and managed to sell things in quite small quantities, but maintain the quality. Sold cooked food, takeaway cooked food, peas pudding, hot soup, cheap meat, soup at a penny a pint. Tried to build the confidence of poorer people, and then move on to other things. And managed even to actually have a reasonably high dividend. This starts in 1902. But it only lasts for a couple of years. The co-op main meetings vote to close this down after a couple of years. Not because it's a failure. In fact, it's actually all the evidence suggests that it did extremely well, that it was profitable, it meets people's needs. But for some reason, many of the co-op members were not terribly happy about reaching out into poor areas. Maybe a loss of respectability, maybe didn't think it was their core business. So there are attempts to do things that don't actually, that seem to work, but don't continue. And the third strand of it is probably around education, campaigning, doing some practical things. Bolton, again, is one example. Bolton has quite a good women's guild that's doing lots and lots of things. They become involved in all the stuff around the match guilds and matches, managed to persuade the main society only to source safety matches rather than ones that created diseases. So they're doing something very useful there. And practically, they set up a school for mothers to try and help people who are not very familiar or quite knew what to do in early motherhood. I'll come back to some thoughts about that in a little while. So practical things going on and practical campaigning going on, and support for the suffragette movement. So an attempt to sort of be a bit more radical, but in a slightly sort of middle-class way almost. In Kirby and Ashfield, which is Nottinghamshire, strong support for minimum wages. In Ilford, discussions about how to help unemployed mothers. So things are being done, but you sort of ask, or it's now sort of begin to ask the question, is this really sort of about empowering people, or is it really about people actually showing how they can do a bit of do-goodery? I don't know. So it's an issue that sort of is there in the background all the time, I think, as you read through all the co-op stuff. There are one or two, as I say, quite well documented examples of attempts to establish shops that would focus on poorer people. And I think they knew what to do to actually make those work, but have the difficulty of actually encouraging people to do it. So I say this is sort of work in progress because I've still been working on various things around the co-op. And a quotation from the person who wrote the history of the Bolton Education Department of the co-op. If the members of the cooperative societies ever begin to consider shopkeeping and the production of wealth as the sole and aim of their existence, then their doom is sealed. The guy who wrote that, the goal of cooperation was the creation of a new cooperative commonwealth. But I think it's not unrealistic, and that's quite pertinent, to ask the question, did that cooperative commonwealth include the marginalised? Or did it really only include the people who had enough money to spend, to save, and to use their dividend? So a sort of question there. How inclusive actually is the vision? And is there a sort of potential conflict between being respectable and influential on the one hand and getting stuck into the poor areas on the other? And what are the benefits for the wider movement of actually focusing on some of these less profitable areas? Especially if the central stores that look like and actually like department stores are at the better selling point and more profitable. And there is the almost curse of having to maintain a high dividend. One of the more extreme examples in Sheffield was the suggestion that actually the wages of people employed in the shops might be reduced, so that the dividend will be maintained at a higher level. It's not always terribly as ethical as you might think. Right. And one last thought is the nature of the sources, which is why I say it's sort of work in progress. The Jubilee histories usually published around the 25th anniversary of the co-op are full of information, very much sort of celebratory and not critical. The manuscript sources are voluminous and scattered. There is the National Co-op Archive in Manchester, but it's quite patchy in its coverage. So you're actually trawling around local record offices inevitably. For the Women's Guild, a lot of it's in the Bishopsgate Library, but not all of it. The Belton stuff's in Belton. When you look at the stuff for Sheffield, you find the records are actually in Bradford. So it's a sort of, it becomes a slightly sort of tricky research project actually sometimes to really get to the heart of it all. But hopefully that's just a sort of fairly quick canter through what I've been trying to do around co-op and the poor, and be glad to have any sort of thoughts, comments, questions, whatever. So thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much. So as I say, we'll take the papers in order, which brings us to the second paper this afternoon from Dr. George Gosling, who is a senior lecturer at Wolverhampton, and who will be talking to us this afternoon about social enterprise as self-help, the blind shopkeepers of St. Dunstans. And I'm also, happily obliged to mention that George is currently co-editing a book with Grace Miller on retail and community, which might be of interest to you, Ian. I think you're in it, actually, Ian, which speaks to both the topic he's about to present on and what we just heard about on co-ops from Ian. So George, you've already called everything up. You're good to go?
I think so.
Take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I should say I'm not entirely sure yet whether this paper is going to be the subject of my chapter in that book. I keep changing my mind, but it may well be. If not, it's going to be sitting alongside it. So today's topic that I'm talking about is something that I came across when I started looking into the history of charity shops. And there's already been some good work done here by Jessica Field and others, looking mostly at the sort of post-war foundation of Oxfam shops and the like. And of course, this sits in a kind of longer history of fundraising retail, particularly a sale of second-hand goods, something we can trace back to the early 1800s, perhaps earlier, in the form of charity bazaars. But what I'm looking at is something that's perhaps a bit different. My research looking at is really focusing on the history of the shop. So those other histories may often focus on the history of charity retail as fundraising, with or without the fixed shop space. In my case, I'm focused on the shop itself. And what I've been finding in my research is lots of cases historically of charities running shops for quite different reasons, sometimes partly as fundraising, but sometimes for entirely different purposes. Purposes that I should say Ellie Munro summed up nicely in what I've used as the title for this paper. Sometimes they're a case of really social enterprise as self-help. And this is perhaps what we might be talking about when we look at St. Dunstans. So what is St. Dunstans? Well, for the last 8 years, it's a charity that's been known as Blind Veterans UK. And for its first 8 years, it was known as the Blinded Soldiers and Sailors Committee, after it was founded in the very beginning of 1915. But it quickly became known unofficially and then officially as St. Dunstans. And that was the name of the home, the property in Regent's Park, which was used as a residential home for the treatment and rehab of blinded soldiers in the First World War. There are two men. If we want to do the great and good version of this history, I should quickly mention two people. The person on the left that you see here with the bow tie, this is Sir Arthur Pearson, who was the Daily Express founder who lost his sight to glaucoma and became the president of the Royal National Institute for the Blind in 1914. He set up and ran St. Dunstans until the end of 1921, when he died. He fell and drowned in the bath. And when that happened, the person who was elected as chairman of St. Dunstan's to take over was the person on the right with the pipe. And this is Ian Fraser. He took over St. Dunstan's at the very young age of 24, and it was a position he held for the next 52 years, although often during that time he was doing other things as well. He was a Conservative MP for most of that time and a governor at the BBC in the later part. He had an interesting route in because he actually arrived at St. Dunstan's as a service user. He was blinded at the Somme, and he arrived there in 1916, and just a year later he was put in charge of running the aftercare operations of St. Dunstan's, which was really everything once these people left the home, something which continues to this day, in lifelong support. Sort of long-term support, therefore, for independent living. And this links in with something that's been a kind of consistent part, and a very visible part of St. Dunstan's history, which is the development of assistive technologies. These would include things like typewriters for Braille in the 1930s, helping to set up the Talking Books Library, and then in the 1960s being involved with the introduction of the very recognisable long cane. But central to their sort of mission of restoring blinded veterans to independence was also occupational training. And this might sometimes take the form of training in telephone operating, massage, poultry farming, or market gardening, but more often it came in the form of their workshop training. And this is where men would be trained in new skills around joinery, boot repairing, or making mats and baskets. And when it came to this work, Ian Fraser said that he was doing something quite new in the blind world, because it wasn't just about occupational training that might form a sort of charity, might mean giving employment once these men are trained, but it was about setting them up for financial independence, which he saw as being quite different. And this kind of echoed a wider feeling at the time about what society should do, how it should deal with this particular kind of group of people, of disabled veterans. It's something that Sir William Osler talked about when and this was the influential Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford at the time, kind of notable figure, and he said that there is no question of greater national importance than of how to make these men again effective citizens, capable of earning their own living. So what St. Dunstan's was doing was very much of its time, but how new was it? And in what ways was it actually new? Well, I think it might be worth comparing what was going on at the St. Dunstan's workshops to some other workshops for the blind. For example, those just down the road from the university where I work in Wolverhampton. So the Wolverhampton Society of the Blind was established in the 1870s to give instruction in the use of embossed type. But from the early 1880s, they also had their workshop. And they really trained men in the same range of crafts as at St. Dunstan's. The difference was that you may be able to see at the top of the screen, it says men's workshop. There was a women's workshop as well. That's a notable difference. But in many respects, what they're doing is the same, and it's actually not that unusual in late Victorian and early 20th century charity work sometimes. What we're seeing is a mix of job creation and social work, of skills training, and sort of seeking to instill respectable character traits. But there was a difference between this and what St. Dunstan's was doing when it came to how the men were paid. So in 1918, the Wolverhampton Society joined forces with its counterparts in Birmingham and Walsall to introduce what it called its wage augmentation scheme. And this meant that the men you see on the screen would receive a weekly sum. The amount of this would be determined on a sliding scale based on what were deemed to be the earning capabilities of these men. Men and women, I should say. But this was not the full amount they received. That was in addition to trade union agreed rates of pay for the work that they did. This is quite different from St. Dunstan's, where in St. Dunstan's they received a huge amount of help and support in the home and when they left, but the amount they earned was very starkly linked to the sale of the goods they produced. This doesn't necessarily mean it was a bad income. You know, it was not uncommon in 1918 for the men to earn £2 or £3 a week from this, but how much or how little was very directly linked to their labour. We might say that their income was sort of attuned to market value and the reward of the labour. So that means that the selling of these items is important because, particularly in St. Dunstan's case, that's how men are making a living. So how were these items sold? Well, here again, there are actually similarities between what's going on in Wolverhampton and with St. Dunstan's. So some of the work would be done to order. So a local business or even a municipal department might place an order that they then produce. But a lot of the time it would be producing work that would be sold in their shops. So Wolverhampton, they have a shop from 1899 that sells the goods they produce, and they continue to have a presence in Wolverhampton in the form of a shop for the next 7 decades. It is never as fancy, I should say, upmarket perhaps is a better, more scholarly phrase to use. It's never as upmarket as the St. Dunstan's shop in Regent Street, which is opened by Mr. Selfridge himself in 1922. It is different, but there are a lot of similarities here. In both cases, they try to put the emphasis on the goods that are produced. The items are supposed to be high quality, and that's the basis on which the price is set for them. But there are also ways in which I think both shops are framing the idea of buying from these places as a form of charitable consumption. It's not just that the shop is branded as the charities shop, in this case with the Victory Over Blindness slogan over the window. But as well as browsing in the shop, you were also able to take tours of the workshop to really see and buy into the charitable work being done. And this is something that you see not just in the shop and as well, not just with the shop, but also with the mail order side of the business, which was run from the shop. The advertisements and catalogues are very clearly branded with the charity. It's very clearly about buying and supporting the charity. So with St. Dunstan's, the shop and the mail order service run from there is important because through them, men are assured of a permanent market. But in the case of St. Dunstan's, this is very much a sort of safety net. It's secondary to the local shops that the men were encouraged to set up all over the country when they finished their training and left St. Dunstan's. And here they would be selling the same range of goods that they would be trained to make in the workshops. So this would include sort of boot making and repair, picture framing, and making mats and baskets. And I think in these shops, there is, similar to the central shop I showed you for St. Dunstan's, I think there is a real mix of charity and commerce going on here. the commercial side is very clearly foregrounded, but there are some things going on here. So you might be able to see under where it says WV Sergeant on the bottom right picture, underneath that it says trained at St. Dunstans. And this is something that I found lots of really bad photos showing on the sign under the name, perhaps with a sign over the door saying trained at St. Dunstans. And this is a really common way to do it. So it is making local customers know that that's what they're doing. They're supporting a St. Dunstaner, as they were known. But there's another part of it too, which Ian Fraser talked about, and he was talking about the relationships forged. So for him, it was important that the local customer base that is established might also be the beginnings of a kind of community support network, helping these men readjust to their new lives in the community. So again, charity and commerce mixed in a variety of ways. And these shops, I think, changed over the kind of mid-20th century. I think there's a shift we can identify. The shops that we see before the Second World War are these typical range usually. There's a focus on selling the work of his hands. But what we see after the Second World War is something else coming to the fore that was around, but much rarer in the early days. And that was St. Dunstaners running shops as newsagents, confectioners, tobacconists, and the like. And I think one of the things that may have helped this shift was the shop trustee scheme that St. Dunstan set up in 1948. This had two parts. Firstly, they would train men as shopkeepers. So there'd be a special course on bookkeeping and other aspects of how to run a retail business. But secondly, St. Dunstan's actually purchased properties which were then held in trust by the charity to be run independently by the St. Dunstaners as their own business. And gradually they could buy the business out of the profits on easy terms. And thus, to quote their report, thus the St. Dunstaner would have the great satisfaction of ownership for himself and his family. In this way, a report from a decade later said, in this way, independence is truly found. And there was a sizable number of these shopkeepers. It's not quite the numbers that Ian was talking about with the co-op, but in 1951, 140 men had been set up and were being supported by St. Dunstan's as shopkeepers. So this was 10% of the St. Dunstaners who were living and working out in the community. But that doesn't include another category, the category of home crafts. Men working in home crafts accounted for 40%. That was a further 550 men around the country. And it's really hard to know what the retail kind of side of things may be for those men who were presumably making mats and baskets or chairs or whatever it might be at home. Were they then sending them to the central shop to be sold? Were they running a sort of shop more or less formal within their own home? That's very hard for us to know, although further work in the kind of case records at St. Dunstan's may help me pin that down a bit more. But this was a large number of people. We're talking sort of, what is that? That's 600, nearly 700 people around the country being supported at that one point. And the support they received from St. Dunstan's included regular visits, usually monthly visits, from both social visitors and technical visitors who would have more of a focus on maintaining the quality of the goods produced and the business side of things. But it also meant developing new technologies specifically for them. So in 1954, St. Dunstan's was working on what they called an entirely new machine that was intended to help a blind and handless tobacconist to collect coins and give out the right change. And really what we're talking about here is them in the mid-50s developing an early version of what we use every time we go on a toll bridge or into into a car park before credit cards, I suppose, which is, throwing your coins in and getting them back. It also included developing Bray weighing scales, although a 1955 report noted that in most shops, the St. Dunstaner's wife will usually look after this side of the business. And the fact that these were kind of always envisaged, it was always implicit, if not explicit, that these were intended to be joint husband and wife business ventures. That's sort of an implicit corollary to the central mission And I think it's important that as well as restoring men to a kind of role as the head of a household, the idea that it was the head of a family business as well, in the case of poultry farmers or shopkeepers, this is really something I think quite central to the kind of vision of what St. Dunstan's is trying to do. And so I'll just finish by saying that this idea of restoring disabled veterans, blinded veterans in this case, to a kind of breadwinner respectability needs to be understood in some wider contexts. So there's a particular moment here, kind of a post-First World War moment, where there's a fear of radicalized and brutalized men, the sort of demobbed masses who posed a threat to bourgeois values, values that could hardly be better typified than in the image of the shopkeeper. This is, I think, a distinct moment casting a long shadow, but also, of course, tapping into something much longer around the kind of the exclusion of disabled people from the labour market and efforts to address that. But it also taps into another longer trend, and that's one in charity history, a kind of persistent morality that insists that financial independence is better than reliance on charity. And I think in this respect, the St. Dunstan's retail operations reflect something very traditional in the history of charity, but also at the same time, a very different kind of charity shop from what we might think of. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Very interesting. Some incredible photography in the first two presentations as well, I should say. As an early modernist, I always look at that stuff and I'm just like, where's, you know, why couldn't they have invented a camera for me? So our last paper, before we move to questions, is from Dr. Georgina Brewis, who is a senior lecturer at UCL, who's actually going to sort of take us in a slightly different direction, very exciting direction, and talk about charity archives in a time of crisis. I also want to take a moment to plug another forthcoming book, this time from Georgina and some co-conspirators, titled Humanitarianism in the Modern World, the Moral Economy of Famine Relief. And actually, once Georgina kicks off, what I'll do is I'll just put some links to the two books that I have up in front of me anyway, from George and Georgina, in the chat for everyone if they want to go take a look at that. So over to you, Georgina.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk not really about any one or more research projects, but really about the source base that both the previous presentations that we've just heard use. And we had some kind of reflection on that in the first talk from Ian, when he was talking about his kind of the difficulties of accessing records of the cooperative movement. So does this, let's hope this works. No, I can't move it along. Oh, hang on, there we go. Sorry. Okay, so what I want to say is that I'm going to just reflect on this particular moment of crisis and why I think charity archives are particularly at risk. But to start with a point to make, which is that charity archives are always at risk. They have been for a long time. They basically suffer from inadequate legal protection. So unlike public records, there's very, very limited restrictions on what charities need to keep for various record-keeping purposes. This, of course, is not unique. This is similar to other private archive sector, particularly the business archives world, religious archives and other kind of non-public records. But there are a unique set of circumstances that potentially mean that charity archives, or the archives of voluntary organisations, community groups, are particularly at risk. In terms of definitions, as many of you know, this kind of sector is very, very hard to define. So when I say charity archives, I do mean all of those voluntary organisations, NGOs, groups that might be community groups having some kind of public benefit, and not necessarily just registered charities. So the sector, as many of you know, again, is large and diverse. There are around 160,000 voluntary organisations, according to the latest counts through NCVO. Most of those are micro, small, with no paid staff, probably not much premises. But there are around 700 charities in the UK that are very large, as NCVO describes them, and they have an income of over 10 million. In terms of the archives and records of these organisations, it's a really mixed picture. So we know that basically there are sort of several hundred UK voluntary organisations that have a professional archivist or records manager. That would kind of be the really kind of top of the kind of apex. There will be thousands then that have deposited their records in some kind of repository. That could be a national institution like the British Library, university record office, and local record offices. Universities, some of them have developed particular collecting areas, interests such as SOAS, Hull History Centre, Birmingham. Some of these deposited collections include very high profile, quite recently deposited collections such as the Oxfam archive at the Bodleian, or the Save the Children Fund Archive at Birmingham University. Those have been accompanied by large grants for cataloguing and for kind of project work, outreach around those, and there's some fantastic initiatives. Others were deposited many years ago and kind of might just be a box in a local authority record office. And then the kind of base of the pyramid, I guess, would be the tens and probably hundreds of thousands of sets of records, both digital, analog, and a huge variety of formats that are retained by organisations in-house in varying states, both of preservation, but also of accessibility. And so how is it possible for researchers to access these? This is a really interesting kind of area. This is myself and other colleagues have, been into these organisations, built relationships to get access to be able to use these kind of in this kind of raw state, which raises a whole set of interesting questions around ethics, around how you reference these collections and things that we could maybe discuss it if you want to. But even that kind of apex, even those most professional, you might think kind of well-funded kind of outfits where they've got a professional archivist or record manager, those are also incredibly vulnerable. As Matthew McMurray's research in 2014 found, that they operate on shoestring budgets, they're very vulnerable to cuts. There's a challenge within an archive service to persuade senior management of the value of that archive to the wider organisation. This is true of all private archives, of course, but particularly in the charity sector, when there's such an emphasis on serving the main constituency of that charity, of kind of delivering the charitable aims, that kind of retaining an archive or a kind of heritage service often is kind of challenged. So what are the risks then? I think there are a lot of risks to kind of these archives being at risk. The first of those is this risk to research. And by that, I don't just mean kind of the papers that we write and the books that we write, but the risks that we have to our understanding of society in Britain today. We can't write the history of modern Britain without understanding how charities, NGOs, voluntary groups of all kinds have entirely shaped our kind of national life and also our kind of welfare state and the services that we have. Linked to that then, there is also a risk associated with that to our kind of understanding, public understanding, through public engagement, through teaching, through learning. Those of us that write and research in this area also teach in this area, and we rely on those records and archives to be able to do so. And then there's a huge risk for organisations themselves. So, and I've written about this quite a lot in various places, and I'll just very quickly summarise that records of an organisation can demonstrate its impact, its commitment over time to a particular group or community. It can enable them to engage with various different national celebrations and anniversaries. There's fantastic examples of this, particularly with the charity that George has just been talking about, Blind Veterans UK, which really kind of did a lot of interesting work around the centenary of the First World War. And they can help you kind of understand the various contributions of staff and trustees, so an organisation's people really, as well as the kind of how these services and activities have evolved over time. Particularly, they can support fundraising and values and brand. I think this is another interesting comparator with business archives, where the two sectors have quite a lot of similarities, but I think in many businesses, there's a real understanding among kind of senior management of the value of the history and heritage of that brand to the organisation's current mission. Whereas if you think about charities, actually it's often more problematic, and sometimes they're kind of concerned about what the history and heritage of a particular charity might be to the current brand. So it's almost a kind of the opposite effect, which is kind of a sort of interesting challenge, I think. There have been a lot of initiatives over the past 30 odd years around recognising that voluntary organisations are particularly at risk. This, of course, is linked to the upsurge of research interest in charity history and voluntary action history and the history of NGOs and humanitarianism that has really taken off, flourished since the 90s, but and in very recent years as well. In the 1990s, the group called the Voluntary Action History Society was formed, and one of the first things it did was launch a campaign to create a national archive of voluntary action. They applied for lottery funding at that time, didn't get it, but they did get an architect to draw some very nice pictures, and you can see here the image of what the National Archive of Voluntary Action might have looked like had it ever emerged. At the similar kind of time, a group called CHARM, the Charity Archivist and Records Management Group, was formed to bring together those archivists, records managers, who are the professionals working within mostly larger charities, as a kind of self-help group really to support each other. In the 2000s, there was a lot of work done by the Dango project at the University of Birmingham, which resulted in a lot of academic outputs that many of us will be aware of in terms of the field of the history of NGOs, but also they kind of left this legacy of this database that is still available to search, although it hasn't been updated for a long time. So it was a kind of a lot of interesting work and survey work, but again, as with many of these initiatives, it kind of stopped and hasn't been taken further. Then coming into the 2010s, I was involved in what we called the Campaign for Voluntary Sector Archives back in 2012. This had arisen out of a kind of personal experience of working in a charity and helping arrange the deposit of that National Charities Archive at the LSE, and a recognition that, you know, even the biggest, the best funded charities in Britain often don't know what to do with their archives at all. That kind of had a bit of a sort of interest. We were supported at that time by the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund, so a philanthropic archive that was depositing its collection at the British Library, and they funded at this launch and a series of events. But since then, we've been really pleased to get support from the British Academy, which since 2014 has supported the work that I've been doing around this. In 2018, a new group called Records at Risk was founded, which is working with TNA to raise awareness about records and archives that could be vulnerable, not just charity archives, but they're taking charity archives very seriously as part of that. And that's a group that I sit on. And in 2017, what I think is a moment of success for this, the National Archives appointed its first sector development manager for charities. The incumbent also has another responsibility for a regional area. That's always the way. They have kind of dual responsibilities. So that's a really brief run through of where we kind of get to. Very briefly on this project, we've been running now for 6 years. We hope we've just received another 5 years that will run until 2024, and hopefully we'll get another 5 years and another 5 years. They are really committed to very, very long-term support at the British Academy, which is great. It's not a lot of money per year, but it could last for decades. So that is actually very good. And in contrast to so much very, very short-term funding that we know plagues this kind of work, both in the lottery funding, but also the research councils. And our project tries to build partnerships. It tries to bring together archivists, historians, other users of archives. It acts as this information point to signpost people that might need sort of support or help with their archive to find it. It creates bespoke guidance and runs events, and we have a website. Please have a look at that and check it out. We just relaunched the website in the last 2 weeks. So I'm quite pleased to share it now. I haven't been pleased to share it for a few months or even the last year because it's been very out of date, but it's just been completely refreshed, which is really nice. So I just want to end with some kind of reflections on the current crisis. And I think I've been trying to point out that these sort of archives are always at risk, but currently there's a kind of toxic combination of quite a few risks. So there's a risk to charities themselves. So we know in the UK that many organisations have been really at the front line of the response to COVID-19, and that includes the formation of new groups like mutual aid organisations across the country. It includes existing charities that have had to adapt and reconfigure services, the creation of the NHS Volunteers programme, which is kind of massively lauded as the largest peacetime recruitment of volunteers, linked to RVS, which fortunately does have a good archive, so we might be hopeful that some of that material will be kind of kept and saved. They've been subject to huge loss of income, loss of most of their kind of income fundraising abilities, furlough and redundancy, leading to things like closures, mergers, office moves. So that's the kind of threat to charity, and with a threat to charities, there's always a threat to their archives, because it's very often at these moments of crisis, such as an office move or a closure, that the archive suddenly think, oh gosh, what should we do with this? And that is this moment of kind of crisis. There is what I've been calling a kind of mania around collecting COVID at the moment, which I think is very welcome. Many organisations across the country, from local record offices to big national institutions in the 4 regions of the UK, those with specific kind of areas, communities of interest, are collecting the experiences of people living through lockdown and through our current pandemic, and that is fantastic. My question is, who is recording the response of voluntary and community organisations to this? Is this being kind of kept? There's been, as we all know, a massive kind of surge of concern around what I like to call, kind of dirty money. So the legacies of slavery, of empire, going into philanthropic trusts. Where does that money go? What does that money support? I think we should be asking serious questions about how open, how accessible are the archives of many trusts and foundations? What can we do to kind of encourage them? There are some really good examples of trusts and foundations that are very open, and there are others that perhaps are not. And I've been trying to see how we can, talk about this with a focus particularly on the archiving aspect of it. I know there's a huge debate across all of this, but my interest really is on the archives, and it's so important that these archives are accessible and are kind of preserved. And then, of course, linking to that, the importance of Black Lives Matter. Of course, Black Lives Matter, but I also argue that Black archives matter, and the archiving of those Black lives is really, really significant. And this is another hugely kind of neglected, risky, underrepresented area. In the UK, a question could be, how well supported are the archives, or are Black and ethnic minority groups to create those archives? There's some fantastic examples, some really good practice going on, but I think there's much more to be done on that. So I'm going to stop now. There's various links if you are interested in looking at the website, reading Matthew's work. The project featured at the British Academy Summer Showcase this week, and there's a 3-minute film about why charity archives matter that I recorded. That was a little bit of a come down, it must be said, from what we had planned, which was going to be a really nice immersive experience, and it's turned into me recording for 3 minutes. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Thanks, Georgina. Lots of food for thought. Did you want to introduce briefly?
Oh, yeah, sorry, completely failed to forget that, sorry. Yeah, so really pleased that a colleague, Katherine Preston, who is the current sector development manager for charities at the National Archives, is here today, and she wasn't able to present formally, but is really keen to sort of introduce herself to the group and just to say a few words. So maybe Katherine can unmute herself.
Thanks, Georgina.
Hi.
Hi, I can't see myself for some reason, but I can see you, so that's good. So I'll keep this quick, but I work in the Sector Development Department at the National Archives, and I'm the Development Manager for the North West regionally and for Charity Archives nationally. So I provide organisations and individuals a range of advice relating to archives, from development to funding and archive management. I work closely with the Charity Archives and Records Managers Group, and I also support charities and organisations where their archives are at risk and we also have, as Georgina mentioned, the Records at Risk Group, which is a mechanism by which we do that. And that's probably it, really. I will pop a little bit of a link to the sector development pages on our website, which kind of outlines what we do there and some of the resources that we have, and also if some contact details if anybody wants to get in touch.
Fantastic, thank you very much.
Well, thank you to all three of our speakers. Very, very interesting papers, all three touching on all sorts of stuff.